The appear effect is perfect for adding animations above the fold since they start automatically when the page loads. But for elements further down the page, we might want to wait to trigger animations until the visitor scrolls to a certain point. This is exactly where another effect called scroll animations comes into play. In this lesson, we'll look at how to trigger animations in Framer based on scroll position, from simple layer reveals to animating entire sections into view. For the lessons in this chapter, we're going to be working with a new project file, and you'll find a link to remix that in the description below. And in this particular lesson, we're talking about triggering animations on scroll, which can be triggered one of three ways, and we're going to go over each one. The first of which is triggering the animation when the animated element itself reaches a certain position. The second is triggering the animation when a section reaches a certain point in the viewport. And the third is triggering the animation just because we're scrolling, either because we're scrolling down or because we're scrolling up. So let's take a look at the project that we're working with here. I'm actually going to hop directly into preview mode and just show you that as we scroll down, we have this sort of hero image here that has some animated elements going on inside that. That's actually just a video. And if I continue scrolling, we have this section here, which presents with this radial gradient that's spinning. We just basically have a loop effect going on there. And then we have this little graphic element that represents a piece of UI. And we want this and this to animate in, and coming back up here, we want this whole thing to animate in. But we don't want it to animate in when the page loads because those are below the fold, so to speak. We don't see them until the viewer scrolls down a bit. So we want to trigger those animations once we've reached a certain scroll position. So what we're going to do first is just select this whole frame. And with this frame selected, I'm going to come down here to effects like we did in the previous chapter. I'm going to click and I'm going to choose to add a scroll animation. Not to be confused with scroll speed or scroll transform, which we're going to talk about in the coming lessons. We're going to start with scroll animation, which again is going to trigger an entire animation on a certain scroll position. So we're going to reach a scroll position and the animation is just going to play. So it's kind of like an appear effect, but an appear effect that occurs at a particular scroll position rather than just happening as soon as the page loads. So here we get a somewhat familiar effect pop over, and the first thing we want to choose is the trigger. What is going to trigger this layer to appear? And we have the on appear effect that we discussed in the previous chapter. And then we have on scroll, which we'll talk about in a moment, layer in view, which is what we're going to use here, or section in view. So we're going to choose layer in view because we want the timing to be relative to the layer itself. So with layer in view selected, we have the option of timing it so that the layer will appear as soon as the top of it reaches the bottom of the viewport, as soon as the center of it reaches the bottom of the viewport, or as soon as the bottom of it reaches the bottom of the viewport, in which case the whole layer would have to come up into the viewport before the effect even gets triggered. I'm going to go with a happy medium here. I'm going to go with center. So when the center of this frame reaches the bottom of the viewport, that's where the effect is going to get triggered. Then I can choose whether or not I want this effect to replay, which is why we have an enter animation and an exit animation. If we want this to play multiple times as the user scrolls up and down, then we need this to come in and then go away so that it could come back in again, right? In order to replay, we've got to replay sort of the back and forth. So with the enter animation, we have how this appears, and with the exit animation, we get to decide how it disappears when it crosses over the top of the viewport. But just know that all these preset animations actually come with both an enter and exit animation together. So I do want this to scale in. I'm going to choose scale in. It applies the scale in enter effect and exit effect, but since I have replay set to no, I actually don't need the exit effect. So I'm going to get rid of that just to make it more clear that we're only working with one effect here. And when I click on the enter effect, we can actually customize how this is going to come in. So very much like the appear effect, the enter effect is where we edit what the layer looks like before it animates in. So it's going to start at 0% opacity. It's going to start at a scale of 0.5 or 50%. I'm actually going to bump that up. I'm going to do a more subtle scale animation where it starts at 70% of its original size instead of starting all the way down at 50%. And then we can have a rotate, skew, offset, etc., just like appear effects. And then down here, we have the transition where we determine how the motion actually happens. I'm actually cool with the default spring for this. I'm just going to increase the time. I'm going to make this a little bit slower and more gradual, like 2 seconds. So I'm going to press Command P on my Mac to preview this, Control P if you're on a PC. And as I scroll down, we're going to reach that point. There it is. So as soon as I reach that point where the middle of this frame reached the bottom of the viewport, that's when the animation took place. So if I scroll up just a little bit and press Command R to refresh this so that that animation hasn't taken place yet, I'm going to do it one more time. There it is. As soon as I cross that threshold, we get that animation where we go from a 0.7 or 70% scale and 0% opacity all the way up to its normal appearance, the way we had it on the canvas. And if I keep scrolling, it doesn't go away because I turned replay off. If I go up and come back down again, it doesn't play again. And that gives us kind of more smooth, reliable performance, and it won't get annoying for the visitor as they're scrolling up and down. They're not going to get hit with that animation over and over again, back and forth. So let's head back. I'm going to head back to the design canvas and let's work on the next one, because the next one's a little bit different down here. We've got this element that I want to slide in from the left, and we've got this element that I want to slide in from the right, but I want both of those to be choreographed so that they happen together at exactly the same time. I don't want one to happen and then the other to happen a little bit later. And as you can see, we've got this element a little bit higher and this element a little bit lower. So if we have these trigger when the top reaches the bottom of the viewport, well, the tops are in different positions. What about the middle? The middles are in different positions. The bottoms are in different positions. So every triggering point we have on the layers themselves is in a slightly different position. So the timing is not going to be choreographed together unless we trigger this when a section reaches, let's say, the top of the viewport. When a section reaches the top of the viewport, we can trigger multiple animations at the same time, all based on that one threshold, that one moment in time where that hits the top of the viewport. So that's exactly what we're going to do. And the section we're going to trigger it on is this whole section here, which is this section called All Magic. And if I scroll up just a little bit, you can see there is the top of it. So when the top of the frame hits the top of the viewport, that's when I want these things to animate in. But first, before we can tell it that we want this section to be the trigger, we need to make sure that a scroll section is set on the properties panel. So you can see here, I've already set a scroll section, but if there wasn't a scroll section set, I would need to get this frame selected and click to add a scroll section and give it a name. You can name it whatever you want, and you can even add a Y offset if you want to trigger this animation a little bit higher or a little bit lower than the top of the frame. But I'm going to leave that all alone, and I'm going to head back to our gradient container, and that's the first one that I'm going to animate here. So back down to effects on the properties panel, I'll click to add an effect. I'm going to choose to add a scroll animation again. And here, rather than layer in view, I'm going to switch this to section in view. And then I get to choose which section is going to trigger this. And that one happened to be called Section All Magic. So that's the one I'll choose. And then here we're going to decide something that looks similar to layer in view, but with section in view, we're actually saying where in the viewport should the top of the section trigger the animation. So with this set to top, when the top of the section reaches the top of the viewport, trigger it. Here, when the top of the section reaches the center of the viewport, trigger it. And here, when the top of the section reaches the bottom of the viewport, trigger it. I'm going to set this so that the top of the section has to reach the top of the viewport, so that the viewer has to scroll a little bit further before this will trigger, at least relative to these other options here. And I don't need this one to replay either. And in this case, instead of fade in, I'm going to have this slide in left, which means slide in from the left. And then because I'm not repeating it, I can get rid of the exit animation and just focus on the enter animation, which is going to start at 0% opacity, and it's not going to scale, it's not going to rotate, it's not going to skew. It's just going to come from a position offset on the x-axis of negative 150 pixels. And as I move this up and down, you can see that we're really just moving this on the x-axis here. But again, I'm happy with negative 150. And then we can just focus on the transition, the movement that's going to happen here. Again, I'm cool with the spring, but I am going to make this longer and more dramatic so it's easier for us to see here. I'm going to go all the way to 3 seconds. And then I just want to take pretty much all this and apply it to that little UI element there. So what I can do here is just right click on the scroll effect that we just created and then choose copy. Then come over here and select this little UI element that I want to animate, and then head down here to effects. And instead of just clicking on effects, I'm going to right click on effects and choose paste. Now, the problem with this is we've got the one on the left animating from the left. And now we also have the one on the right animating from the left. So I want the one on the right to animate from the right instead. So I'm going to go back into the enter effect for this guy. And instead of negative 150, I'm going to make that positive 150. So it's coming from 150 pixels to the right. Therefore, it's going to move to the left. And that spring animation is already going to be set because I copied and pasted this whole thing from the other one. And now we can preview this and see how it's looking. So we've got our first effect here that happens when the middle of that layer reaches the bottom of the viewport. And then going down a bit further, we want to be watching the top of this section, because when the top of this section hits the top of the viewport, there we go. We just triggered this animation, and both of these layers came in at exactly the same time because they're both triggered by the same frame. Cool. So let's head back and I'll show you the one last way that we can trigger an animation on scroll. And for this little header bar or nav bar, we're going to make it so that as we scroll down, it moves up and out of the way. And as we scroll up, it comes back. So with the frame for this whole bar selected, back down to effects, I'm going to click to add an effect. This is again going to be a scroll animation, but here we're going to choose to trigger on scroll, which means trigger on the act of scrolling itself. This isn't about how far we scroll. This is just about whether scrolling is taking place. Is scrolling down happening? Is scrolling up happening? And for this one, we're going to trigger the effect of the bar moving up and out of the way when scrolling down. And then it'll return to its normal position when scrolling up instead. And for this one, we do want to leave replay turned on, so that way as you scroll down, it'll get out of the way. As you scroll up, it'll come back, and vice versa, no matter how many times you scroll up and down. And the closest preset that I could start with is probably slide out top, because slide out top is going to have an effect that moves it up, in this case, negative 150 pixels, which is actually excessive because our nav bar is only 64 pixels tall. So we could set this to exactly 64, or we could round up to 70. So that way the transition is taking place over an appropriate distance. Because if we tell this to move an unnecessary amount, it's going to have to move faster in order to get to that point in the same amount of time. So if we want our duration to correlate more accurately to the actual transition that's visible, we only want it to move as far as what we can see. So in the case of a nav bar, we want it to move up by pretty much its own height. So in this case, transition is set to 0.4, which is a little on the quick side. Let's just do 0.5. And one little problem we're going to have with spring is that it's going to overshoot by just a little bit. And we don't want the nav bar to come down too far. So I'm actually going to switch this from spring to ease, and we'll leave it on ease in and out. So that way we can see it ease in on its way up and ease out on its way down. And again, time set to 0.5, that's looking good. And let's preview this and see what we've got. And there we go. As I scroll down, it gets out of the way. As I scroll up, it comes right back. And you can see here that in the effect, it is fading in. And we don't necessarily need it to fade in since it's coming in from off the screen. So I'm going to revisit the effect itself. And I'm going to say, you know what, let's start at 100% opacity since we can't see it anyways. And then we'll have it move in without the fade. And we'll preview that again. And that is looking good. Now we don't have that unnecessary fade. We've just got the movement in. And as we scroll down, boom, we've got that animation. And again, everything is working together here in perfect harmony. And there you have it. Scroll animations can trigger effects with the rhythm and pacing set by the visitor as they scroll down the page, guiding them naturally through your content, one reveal at a time. That's it for this one. I'll see you in the next one.